It's been 75 years since the birth of modern China, and a lot's happened since then. From housing to healthcare, everything's improved, helping people live fuller, richer lives.
China has contributed to around 70% of global poverty reduction.
Building friendships around the world. That's China's idea of partnership.
Chinese leadership has been very important in bringing peace, security.
From made in China to innovated in China, Chinese tech now leads the way.
China has made wonderful progress in many areas of science and technology.
From a humble beginning to a global economic power, it's a rags to riches tale.
Yes, you can be profitable in China.
We did not observe any country to sustain such a high growth rate.
Ancient philosophy in modern practice. China shows us how we can live in harmony with nature.
When China talks about modernization, it's talking about a green future.
5 episodes, one incredible journey. Buckle up for the CGTN special series Journey to Modernization from September 30 to October 4, only on CGTN.
Hello and welcome to the CGTN special series, Journey to Modernization. 75 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the world has witnessed not only China's rapid economic expansion, but also its enhanced interaction, where it has expanded its ties and mutual interests with the rest of the international community. In an era of momentous changes not seen in a century, China has developed a unique major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. Is China undergoing a fundamental shift in diplomacy? What does this mean to the world? And how is China committed to multilateralism and common development? That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Joining me today are Bob Carr, former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Australia, Huang Jian, University Professor with Shanghai International Studies University, and Jana de Kleiver, Research Officer of Africa in the World at the Institute for Security Studies, Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, and Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow with the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. Welcome to the show. Well, we are talking about the Chinese diplomacy, the new era. I will start with you, Zhao Hai. Some say there's understanding China has been taking on new and broader dimensions over the years of the Chinese diplomacy. How do you characterize the evolvement, the evolution of Chinese diplomacy? Is there any change? If that is the case, what kind of changes are they?
Well, in my mind, I think China's diplomacy is just like a person. It's growing and it's maturing. If you put Chinese diplomacy in stages, I think in the past 4 decades, China going through 2 or 3 stages. And right now, China is more and more trying to play a leading role in reducing the deficit in global governance, in peace, security, and in many areas where globally we both face challenges.
Well, Mr. Bob Carr, yeah, certainly there are changes, just like with any other countries. So how do you see those changes? Are they fundamental or are they simply tactical?
I think the most dramatic changes are China's involvement in Central Asia. The fact that China now has relations of some depth with the nations of Central Asia. It reflects all the Belt and Road initiatives. But I think it's been an achievement of immense public good added to the stock of the world's diplomacy, and Chinese leadership has been very important in bringing peace, security, higher levels of cooperation to the Stand states and more generally in Central Asia. Also striking is Chinese readiness to commit itself to the sponsorship of peace in the Middle East, not only between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but even encouraging reach out and contact in the context of the disastrous and catastrophic events between Israel and Palestine. and also China's readiness to broker a peace in Ukraine.
And Joe Ball, here the former Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy said recently, China used to pursue, quote, a soft and modest diplomatic path, especially globally, where it has positioned itself as a close friend to the developing world. So now China is ready to identify itself as a major power in its economic growth. Do you agree with his observation? Is Chinese diplomacy shifting from soft and modest to, quote, assertive and vocal?
Well, I certainly consider Chinese diplomacy has changed tremendously, but not in a way to describe it as assertive or coercive. China is too big to hide behind a tree. Therefore, you have to pay the price of being a major power. And this is exactly this is exactly what China is doing now to show the greater international responsibility. Because nowadays, everything that doesn't seem to have anything to do with China would eventually end up having a lot of things to do with China. Mm-hmm. This is the thing in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, which has nothing to do with China. And this is, again, thing in the Middle East, where conflict is spreading. But people would ask you, what is your position? Which side would you take? Why can't you just pick up the phone and give President Putin a call and ask him to stop? And likewise, in the Middle East, why can't you just join the American navies to safeguard freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and fight back against the Houthis? So this tells people's fantasy or dream or hope for China. But then what are Chinese doing? I think there are two turning points that are critically important for China. One is for PLA, that is PLA's counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden is a turning point for PLA Navy to become a truly global and blue water navy. And then about China's successful mediation between Saudis and the Irans, that is another turning point in Chinese diplomacy to make it more proactive and forward-looking.
Oh, you do see changes, concrete changes in the Chinese diplomacy. So, Jana de Kleiver, your observation?
There's definitely been some fundamental changes in these past few years, but even just going back to the previous question, I would 100% agree. We're not necessarily seeing an assertive China, but we're seeing a China trying to grapple with the increased responsibilities oftentimes associated with a global power. So this is very unique also in how China is trying to balance these requests also with its own national interest and its greater developmental goals. So going forward, I would say we're still going to see China stepping forward more and more in planes such as the security area, through avenues such as the Global Security Initiative, increasingly the Global Development Initiative and the Global Civilization Initiative, increasing their cooperation with developing regions such as Africa and similar.
Mm-hmm. Well, Huang Jing, China described its policy as a major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. I mean, summary to a certain degree. What's your understanding of that? How does that have to do with, say, increasing responsibility as a major power in the world?
What really happened is that China itself has changed tremendously. China is growing up and growing up very quickly, just about 10 years or 20 years, which is a very short time in history. China is growing into #2 power and actually #1 trading power on earth. China's interests, China's own interests, is involved in almost every corner of the world. So as a result, China has to be more proactive in international affairs. But one thing has remained the same, it's never been changed. That is China. Ever since Deng Xiaoping's reform and openness policies adopted in the 1980s, China has always been a status quo power. In that regard, I believe China has been more confident, #1. Number two, more proactive. And #3, of course, China always has to work for its own interests. In that regard, China's peaceful approach or doing some, trying to solve conflicts through dialogues, through communications, through cooperation, rather than conflict or even war.
So, Mr. Bobakar, turning to you here, if you look at the Chinese policy on Ukraine, on Gaza, which is very different from that of Washington, how do you look at the difference?
First of all, on the Middle East, on Israel, Palestine, Beijing is not subject to the same remorseless and very powerful pressure of the Israel lobby as are policymakers in Washington. That's the key difference. America has never been able to block Israeli nationalist governments from spreading settlements on the occupied West Bank. And when it's always come to a test, America's always stepped back under Republican or Democrat presidents from disciplining Israel, punishing Israel for the spread of settlements, all of which are illegal under international law and which make a peace agreement on the principle of two states living side by side utterly impossible, utterly impossible. So that's China brings to Israel-Palestine diplomacy the prospect of brokering a peace uninhibited by an obligation to the political power of the Israel lobby, something that inhibits the United States. Nonetheless, it is extraordinarily difficult to negotiate a peace between an Israel that is so strong and Palestinians who are so weak and divided and vulnerable. On Ukraine, I think the prospect of Chinese leadership offers the prospect that when both sides are exhausted and are seeking a peace without advantage to either side, a peace based on a ceasefire agreement, China has indicated that it's there ready to facilitate such a peace. And it could well be that China's brokering of the peace is acceptable to both sides, to Ukraine as well as Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jana de Kleiver, if you look at the Chinese policy in the Middle East, China has been rather active in, say, supporting the Palestinians in terms of reaching a ceasefire, reaching a peace deal, if possible, with Israeli side. But also, China's policy is kind of in line with all the global South. Is that so?
I would definitely say what's interesting about China's increased presence in the security space, as well as brokering deals such as what we've seen in the Middle East, is unique in the sense of the principle of non-interference. I think it's still taking some time for the international community to come to grasp that although China will step towards the table, they're going to do it in a Chinese way that might be distinct from more of an interventionist approach that we've seen from previous larger powers in the international system. So within that response, I think calls to have a more assertive China or to have more of an interventionist approach is just never going to happen. And it's very much necessary to understand that this different type of viewing it might also produce some of outcomes that we haven't seen before. So in that regards, I would say the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence is heavily influencing in how the strategy is rolling out.
Huang Jing, there's a rising expectation of the Chinese role in terms of peace, in terms of negotiation, partly because of the successful role in bringing together Saudi Arabia and Iran. People are expecting China to play a sort of a role like in Ukraine conflict, and also please help us understand or clarify, like if you talk to the people from the West, from Europeans or the US, they would just, basically lump China and Russia together. It's like China is supporting Russia.
I think that China's position has always been very clear. I'll summarize it in 4 points. The first point that is China always, uphold the charters of United Nations. China, is always condemns the violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Ukraine. This has made very clear by Chinese leaders like Wang Yi and Liu Jianchao. And second, Chinese believe that the kind of the real essential cause, the real cause of this Ukraine war, very, very unfortunately, is Cold War behavior and Cold War mentality. We know that in 1991, Soviet Union integrated and the entire Warsaw Pact disappeared, dissolved. But NATO is still there. Not only big NATO is still there, but NATO continuously to expand eastwards, put pressure on Russia. That's why Russia has to react on that. This so-called Ukraine conflict started not in 2020, but in 2014, 15, or even 2008. And China always said, if we want really resolve the issues, the conflict crisis, Ukraine, we have to stop this so-called Cold War mentality and the Cold War behavior. And thirdly, China is always holding the so-called principled neutrality in this conflict. China trying to work with all the major powers, especially those Europeans and Russia included, to sit down and to talk. We cannot argue that, oh, China, if you not side with me or side with Russia, I don't believe that's the case. The very reason China is able, and is willing to play a mediator role is exactly because China has not taken side to any side.
Well, Zhao Hai, China's foreign policy aims at building a community with a shared future for mankind.
China is using its own historical experience to try to tell the world that there's no hierarchy in your civilization, in your culture, in your language, your race, and everybody should be treated equal. And also on political system, it doesn't matter if you have American-style democracy, if you have a Russian-style democracy or Chinese-style democracy, it's all democracy. Different people choose their different ways. So ultimately, if we want to have world peace, we need to recognize and respect each other's political system, history, language, background, and that's ultimately, you can combine people's will together to move forward. Right now, some people try not to accept China's vision for the world and try to argue against China's pushing through this peace agenda around the globe and still maintaining what Professor Huang has mentioned, this Cold War mentality and Cold War structure. The reason, of course, is for their own benefit, maintaining their own hegemony or their own interest in the world. But that's self-interest. And developing countries are more and more seeing through this and knowing that without changing or modifying the current international system, that system cannot benefit all. So we're pushing this reform, not overthrow this system, but to reform the system so the system can work better for everybody.
A very important application of the vision, the Chinese vision, for building a community with a shared future for mankind is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative.
The aim of the Belt and Road Initiative, proposed by China in 2013, is to construct a trade and infrastructure network connecting Asia with Europe and Africa along the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road to seek common development and prosperity. By October 2023, China had signed BRI agreements with 152 countries, 33 of them from North America, South America, and Oceania, showing that BRI cooperation expands far beyond the ancient roots. The great potential of the BRI is shown through the connectivity of its infrastructure. It is a multi-tiered, multi-dimensional global network based on 6 corridors, 6 routes, and multiple countries and ports. Major projects such as the China-Laos Railway, the Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway, and the Pelješac Bridge in Croatia have been completed and are already operational. From 2013 to 2022, the total trade volume between China and BRI partner countries reached $19.1 trillion, with an annual growth rate of 6.4%. The total investment amount between China and BRI countries reached $380 billion, including $240 billion from China. China has also funded the establishment of the Silk Road Fund and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with other participating countries. By the end of June 2023, the fund had agreed to invest some $22 billion in 75 projects, and the bank, now with 106 members, had approved 227 projects with a total investment of $43.6 billion. These projects involve transportation, energy, public health, and other fields, providing investment and financing support for infrastructure connectivity and sustainable economic and social development. In April 2023, European think tank Bruegel released a paper titled Global Trends in Countries' Perceptions of the Belt and Road Initiative, which noted that the BRI is generally viewed positively around the world, and there is particularly positive sentiment towards the BRI in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, Zhou Bo, of course, as Zhao had mentioned about, some of the Western nations, probably find it hard to trust the Chinese vision, the Chinese efforts. That also includes the Belt and Road Initiative.
The question is, what is Belt and Road Initiative? It is certainly a Chinese endeavor to provide assistance to the developing countries. Yeah? And at the same time, we also aim to make it mutually beneficial. So it certainly is not a trap. When some people talk about the Belt and Road Initiative to be a trap, I can answer by asking a very simple question. Would you spend $1 trillion to lay a trap yourself?
Right. That's not cost effective. Well, Jana the Clever, so in the video, we have seen these facts, some of the facts and figures about Belt and Road Initiative. In your opinion, where are we now? It has been 30 years. I think this is the first put forward, in particular in the African continent.
Now, what we saw in the initial years of the Belt and Road in Africa is I think we saw China that was learning how to best implement it in an environment that it was not very familiar with in some aspects. So we saw some failures and we saw some successes, which is natural. And I think this is something you would see in terms of any big power starting out the engagements. But what is very important, in my opinion, is the fact that we have started to see shifts towards making it better adapted to Chinese domestic realities as well as African needs. What I mean by this, for example, is since 2021, we saw this push for small and beautiful infrastructure investment in terms of projects that have a higher profitability and a quicker turnaround, which oftentimes makes it better within the African context and markets that might not be able to carry such a large debt burden, as well as addressing some of the more sustainable and green needs that the African continent ultimately requires to move towards Agenda 2063. So these types of shifts is very central to it. As we saw at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, we saw how the African Union and regional economic communities was increasingly being included within these spaces. And that is absolutely central towards having a more coordinated way forward for the Belt and Road in Africa.
Mr. Boubacar, obviously there's a learning curve, there's adaptation, there are changes with the Belt and Road Initiative over the past decades. But still you do see, it is overwhelmingly, let's say, welcomed by the developing world, by the global South. But the Western world are more concerned. So that's a concern with the initiative. You see these differences. How do you address this different response to the Belt and Road Initiative?
I think there's a lot of anxiety within the Western world, especially from the United States, about what they lament as a loss of primacy. And I think that explains a lot of the negativity about the Belt and Road. As I see the Belt and Road, China has completed, in large measure, a huge burst of modernization. You take as a symbol of that the high-speed rail. China's linked all its cities by high-speed rail. It's natural that China would look at opportunities to deploy that technology beyond China's borders. So the process of modernization completed within China, if we take this high-speed rail as an example, is flung beyond China's borders to the benefit of countries that are receiving it. I think China's got to answer its critics by saying this is transparent, by saying that it is thoroughly green in all its implications. I think China's got to be able to say that Belt and Road is thoroughly transparent, and two, that in every respect is compatible with China's own environmental goals and those of the community of the world, that it's compatible with the aspirations of UN-convened conferences on climate change. China's got a great story to tell about the funding of renewables, and China needs to continue to embed renewable technologies and are reaching for a cleaner world environment, answers to climate change as part of the Belt and Road. And I think that will answer any critics.
Mm-hmm. Well, Huangjing, sort of related to Belt and Road Initiative, China has insisted actually at the different occasions that China was, is, and always will be part of the global South. Why such a principle? Why such a policy?
In my view, Global South are coming together, not because what they want, but because what they do not want. They do not want to go back to colonialism. They do not want to be bullied by the so-called, developed world. They do not want being, unfairly treated in terms of distribution of natural resources on this earth. Let me just give you one example. United States alone consume about 68 barrels of oil per person in a year. And the average developed countries consume about 38 barrels of oil per year. But you know how much the global south is doing in this regard. Let me give you 5 major so-called BRICS countries. That is Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, and India. China is barely 7 barrels per person each year. India is the poorest. India is at 2.7 barrels per year. And after South Africa, the statistics in 2023, 2022 is barely 12 barrels. Brazil is about the same rate. Russia is doing best, is only about 15 barrels. You see the differences there. So therefore, what Global South want are 3 things. Number 1, peace. Number 2, equality, equal treatment. Number 3, equal distribution of natural resources for all share on this world we call the Earth, or Mother Earth. I think that's what Global South put them standing together. It's not only because of common interest, but because what they do not want to be treated as a member of our global community in this world.
That might explain, China's pursuit of multilateralism or common development. But let's put that aside, Mr. Boubacar. Now, here's a question. Can China rise peacefully? Can China achieve its national rejuvenation without being seen as a menace, say, to the U.S. primacy?
I think America is almost determined to see what China does as a threat to primacy. I think it's in China's interest to be aware of the deep pathologies at work in American life. America, which we might describe as the prevailing power in the world, the strongest power in the world militarily, is acutely scared of being seen to lose its power of saying what happens and what doesn't happen on the global stage. But America has got to live with the fact that it is a more pluralistic world where power is shared among important nations. Now, that's a big adjustment for the United States. And I think China needs to be cautious as it manages its rise. And if cautious, China can do everything to see that its rise takes place without a breakdown in the bilateral relationship the world needs between China and the US. Not a sacrifice of national interest by either side, but the prospect of a kind of détente between China and the US, such as you had between the US and the Soviet Union, even at the height of the Cold War. Surely China and the US are able to explore what they've got in common and not to give in to pathological responses. China can help that process by being very selective in its diplomatic positioning. I think China can enjoy the increased clout that it has on the world stage with initiatives like peace broking in Russia, Ukraine, like the reconciliation negotiated between the Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was a very significant diplomatic breakthrough that only happened because of the prospect of Chinese involvement, bringing the 2 sides together. I think that sends a message to the world that the rise of China is completely compatible with yearnings for peace and security.
Mm-hmm. Or Joe Boy, put it in another way, can the U.S. remain number 1 when China realizes its goal of national rejuvenation?
Well, it depends on how you define being number 1, because some foreigners say China today is already number 1, judging by PPP, right? So judging by GDP, it is the second one. And then China also aims to have world-class military by 2049. Then the question is, how many world-class militaries are there already in the world? If there is one, of course, that is the United States. But if there are more than one, probably China is already one of the world-class military, right? So it really depends on your criteria. But looking down the road, I would say that I sometimes really think about this, because once I attended a conference, and then a British scholar asked this fascinating question. He said, okay, tell me, what is the most ideal world that the Chinese are most happy with, but in which foreigners can also live? I thought about this question for a long, long time, and then I concluded there's no such a world. Yeah, because China has to live together with other nations, and that is why, talking about international order, China basically is a beneficiary of globalization, which is rooted in the current international system, which is supported by rules and regimes basically tailor-made by the West. But the problem with the West is that they just consider these rules and regime for economic engagement are just the international order. No, they're part of the order. The international order is much more complicated. In my opinion, it would include your national identity, your culture, your different philosophies, and above all, civilizations. So this is the whole order. So in which China has a due place, and because of China's heft, China needs to contribute more to the well-being of the rest of the world. But China is just a part of the whole world. China would not dominate the world.
Well, you mentioned the international order. I think we are actually talking about this international order. Zhao Hai, in January, the Minister for the International Department of the CPC Central Committee, Mr. Liu Jianchao, reiterated in a speech that China is a creator, beneficiary, and a defender of the existing international order, and it seeks neither to change it nor to reinvent the wheel or build a so-called new order.
Yep.
But of course, others would say at the same time, China is also calling for a more just and equitable world order, or reforming the global order. So people would say, what is the true intention of China? Is China happy with the international order or not?
Well, we have to separate these two things. First of all, what China described as the current international order is based upon, number one, the United Nations at the center. And number two, everybody obey by the same international law. And if that's the widely recognized international order, we don't want to change that. And we actually wanted to reinforce and improve on that basis, particularly improve the efficiency of the United Nations, make it more inclusive, and make its organizations helping more developing countries, right? And also we wanted to guard the international law, make sure everybody abide by it. The second thing is that when you want to uphold United Nations and the international law, you need other major powers to participate, to contribute, and to maintain the stability and viability of that system. Right now, I think, relative to what Zhou Bo has said previously, is that when you consider the United States, right, it's the #1 contributor to the United Nations, and after World War II is the main builder of the current international system. But today, the U.S. don't want to continue to show that burden, right? And that's the fundamental problem, because part of the United States want to continue to play a leadership role, but wanted to only enjoy the benefit and giving up the responsibility. And other part of the United States wanted to completely give up their responsibility and let others to take all these burdens, and the United States just wanted to go into isolationism and enjoy their own stay. So I think at the end of the day, not only we need to ask where China's national rejuvenation is going, what's the goal, and how we achieve that, but also we need to ask other countries and other peoples whether or not you want to have a international order that everybody shares and everybody share the same resources and contribute the same amount. That's why I think, going back to the original idea, why China in the past 10 years so wanted to move forward with the idea of a shared community of the future for mankind, the fundamental reason is that now in our world, we have such a division on where the future lies and how to achieve a more inclusive goal.
Mr. Bobakar, so can China and the US find the room or enough room to coexist in a peaceful way?
I believe they can, and I believe they must. And what I would recommend is that spirit of détente. I think that partners and friends, allies of both China and the US should seek every opportunity to encourage China as the rising power, America as the prevailing power, if you're comfortable with those terms, to explore opportunities for expanding collaboration. The differences are always going to be there, but the air should not be filled with anxiety about loss of primacy and, on China's part, exuberant expressions of overconfidence. America, in one sense, is not in decline. America is in comparative decline because other powers in the world are now significant players in a way that they weren't. But America could well have a global reach, a military global reach, for a very long time to come. And it is in the interest of the peoples of the world that the US and China find a peaceful path of resolving their differences. And I believe that can happen.
Well, let's turn to our audience to see what kind of international order they are expecting to have in a few years or in a few decades. I think you may write down a few keywords, or you can express yourself in a couple of sentences. Okay, if you're ready to share.
My three keywords are responsibility, equitable, and harmony. My ideal international order is one in which all countries shoulder their responsibilities to global challenges, have a say in international affairs, and also to resolve their differences through peaceful means to build a harmonious world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I would like to have Jana de Kleyer to respond.
I think that's a future international order I would like to live in. The center of it in terms of responsibility is something that is not spoken about often enough, where states' own agency and autonomy, be it through major powers, be it through developing powers, be it through states that do not necessarily have that much weight in the international system, they should still take responsibility for their domestic policies as well as the international actions. In terms of a more equitable society, I could not agree more. I think we are making, in some ways, strides forward, in other ways, strides back. But having an increasing voice for the global south in platforms, be it through BRICS, be it more space in international forums to ultimately voice their opinions, it's definitely necessary that we reform those spaces and also give a voice to countries that have oftentimes been marginalized. So I'd very much agree with those three words.
Let's say next student, please.
Well, the three keywords I have chosen, they are multilateralism, cooperation, and sustainability. Since from my perspective, they foster an environment where dialogue is prioritized over confrontation, and they are all essential for global resilience and prosperity.
Yes, I really like this three, especially multilateralism. I just want to make one point, so to drive the point I'm trying to make. That is, after 1991, after Cold War is over, we have been witnessing many crises on Earth. The Georgia crisis, the Libya crisis, the Kosovo crisis, the crisis in South China Sea, the crisis in the Taiwan Strait, and of course, the crisis of North Korea's nuclear weapon program. Have we seen this? A very strong point, clear point, that all the crises, involve United States and its allies. Every one of them ended up in a war, no exceptions. But all the crises, China's being involved. China's playing a major role, like crisis in South China Sea, crisis in Taiwan Strait, crisis in North Korea, and so on and so forth. None of them, we see a war, not a single bullet has been fired. That's a quite different approach. Fact is more, tells what happened. So the point I try to make is that China is indeed, trying to approach this world with a peaceful meanings and peaceful development. Not only because Chinese love the peace, but because peace, just like this young woman just said, multilateralism, peace, cooperation, to make our development more sustainable, that serve China's interests first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Let's have one more comment from the audience on this side.
Well, I expect the world order to be multipolar, fair, and inclusive, which means that every country can ride the wave of global development.
The question is, how fair can the international order become? I don't think it could become equally fair for all countries. But I think as a Chinese, China does have a role, because it is different from other major powers, in shaping this order to make it more justifiable and more fair for developing countries. Just now we have been talking about China's role in the global south. The first question is China the leader of global south or not? China only describes itself as a natural member of the global south. But I would say China is a de facto leader. Why? Because if China is not the leader, who else can be the leader? India? Even if India becomes the third largest economy in 4 to 5 years' time, but India will only become as rich as China today in 2050. So China, being the largest developing country and a natural member of the global south, should actually make this world more livable, for the whole developing country. And China can play a unique role. Why is that? Because at least China can tell the world how we have managed to alleviate the poverty of 800 million people in a matter of 40 years. No one can do that. This is a Chinese lesson which can be shared by all developing countries.
My words also include multilateralism, and the other two words are law-based and mutual respect.
I think China and other countries needs to reinforce the law, international law. That is very important. Since the United States broke law in 2001 after it got attacked by terrorists, but then retaliated without UN authorization, that's the beginning of breaking. I mean, there are other previous cases, but in the 21st century, that's the beginning. And then after that, there's a continuous relaxation of following the international law. And now I think that's the task we need to really tell us to commit to. And in the future, again, with the law, we can hopefully accomplish multilateralism in the future world. And hopefully that will bring us more peace and more prosperity.
More peace and more prosperity. With that, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our distinguished panel of guests and our audience for joining us of the discussion of the CGTN special series, Journey to Modernization. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.